For the past few days, Sayadaw has been explaining how the Nama Rupa arise as cause and effect. And Sayadaw had given example of the Nama cause giving rise to Rupa effect, Nama cause giving rise to Nama effect from both theoretical and practical aspects. And time is not enough to explain all the examples. Sayadaw only explained the examples that are obvious and that are easy to be understood. By being mindful, by noting the object respectfully, meticulously, one understands the example as explained in the text through one's own practice. Sayadaw had already explained the Nama cause giving rise to Rupa effect, Nama cause giving rise to Nama effect, and Sayadaw will continue to explain the Rupa cause giving rise to Nama effect. It will not be complete, but Sayadaw will explain the most obvious example. Sayadaw gives the example that is most obvious. At the sixth sense door, there are the sensual objects that strike the sixth sense door. And seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, knowing takes place. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and knowing are the Nama. And when the object strikes the sixth sense door, based on the seeing, there is the seeing contact, hearing contact, smelling contact, tasting contact, touching contact, and knowing contact. And based on whether the object is pleasant or unpleasant, there are pleasant and unpleasant feelings. There are pleasant and unpleasant feelings connected with the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and knowing. In the Nama, there are the seeing consciousness, seeing contact, and seeing feeling, which are Nama, mentality. So, when the object come into contact with the sixth sense door, the seeing consciousness, seeing contact, seeing feeling, hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling takes place. At the moment of hearing, the hearing consciousness is not wholesome and it is not unwholesome. Seeing consciousness, hearing consciousness, they are called abhyagata, indeterminate consciousness. In other words, they are called vipakasita, they are the resultants. Sayadaw explains in most simple words so that even the young ones can understand in the Suttanta way. The example is given in the hearing process. Sayadaw is giving talk. The sound waves are striking the ears. The sound wave strikes in the ears, not the eyes or the nose or the tongue or body, not the heart, but the sound wave strikes the ears. So in the ears, there is the sensitivity that receives the sound wave. As the sound wave strikes the ear sensitivity, hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling takes place. Hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling are the Nama mentality. And one is mindful of the hearing as a whole. There is nothing else. In the hearing, there is nothing else apart from the sound waves and the ear sensitivity, which are the materiality. Hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling, which are the Nama mentality. There is no other things. But for the person who do not practice Vipassana meditation, and for those who have not learned Abhidhamma, they tend to think that in the hearing there is the soul, there is the I that is doing the hearing. And some take it as it is the human that is hearing. Or they think that in the hearing there is the Jiva Atta, individual soul. One hears by the Jiva Atta, individual soul. In this way, many people have wrong view that it is the person who is hearing, it is the Jiva Atta who is hearing, it is the man who is hearing, and so on. And here, Sayadaw explains that if there is a shiny surface that is smooth, then the image can be seen on the smooth surface, such as the mirror or the brass. So in the clear mirror or glass, when a person goes close, the person can see the image. In the same way, there is the rupa, materiality, the sensitivity, materiality, where the object strikes and the consciousness takes place. And just as the image is seen on the mirror, in the same way, the object strikes the base and seeing, hearing, consciousness takes place. When the sound wave strikes the ear sensitivity, hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling takes place. Without the ear sensitivity, hearing cannot take place. If the sound waves and the hearing consciousness do not come into contact in the ear, then one will not hear. If the hearing consciousness and the sound wave does not come into contact in the ear, there will not be hearing consciousness or hearing feeling. In the ears, there are the sensitivity that can receive the sound waves. When the sound waves strike the ear base, and if the attention is adverted onto the hearing, then hearing takes place. Hearing consciousness is the Nama. Because there is the ear sensitivity, one can hear If the ear sensitivity is good, one will hear clearly. But if the ear sensitivity is weak, his or her hearing will also be weak. And if the ear sensitivity is not as sensitive, then the person hears very vaguely. If the ear sensitivity is lost for some reason, then the person does not hear at all. The example is given: if the mirror is dirty, or if the steel or the mirror is dirty, one will not be able to see the image. However, one goes very close to the mirror, one will not see the image if the mirror is very dirty. In the same way, if the ear sensitivity is no good, the person will not hear, however the sound waves strike. So it is very important that the ear sensitivity is good in order to hear. The ear sensitivity is the rupa, materiality. Only if there is the ear sensitivity and the sound wave, then hearing will take place. If there is no sound, hearing will not take place. If the sound waves and the hearing consciousness come into contact in the ears, hearing consciousness, hearing contact, hearing feeling takes place. Even though the sound wave strikes the ear base, but if the attention is not averted, then hearing consciousness will not take place. So there are the circumstances for the hearing. The circumstances for the hearing is the sound wave, the ear base, the attention, and also there should not be any blockage. If there are earplugs in the ear, the person will not hear. Or if there are some kind of blockage, like a wall, it will prevent the hearing. There should also be attention which is the nama. Only if there is attention, then the person will hear. If the attention is not averted to the hearing, the person will not hear. And yesterday, Sharaji explained how the attention nama cause give rise to nama effect. And Sharaji will continue to explain how rupa cause gives rise to rupa effect. Even ordinary people, if they are explained, they will understand very easily. But in order to understand through one's practice, one should be mindful at the moment of hearing in order to discern the nama rupa. And Sharaji explains the usage, how it is called. The ear sensitivity is the receptor element where it receives the sound waves. As the sound wave strikes the ear base, the sound waves are called the striker element. And this is compared to the matchbox and the matchstick. On the matchbox, on the side of the matchbox, there is the substance called the potassium nitrate on the side of the matchbox. And also on the tip of the matchstick, there is also the potassium nitrate. And if one strokes the matchstick with the matchbox, then the spark will arise. In this example, the receptor element, ear sensitivity, is like the matchbox, and the striker element, the sound waves, is just like a matchstick. So when the sound waves strikes the ear base, then the hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling takes place. Hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling are the ignition element, which is compared to the sparks when one strokes the matchstick with the matchbox. Dhatu are the elements which bear their own intrinsic nature. They bear their own nature. The sensitivity element also has its own nature. The sound waves also are the element which bears its own nature. So when the sound wave, the striker element, strikes the ear base, the receptor element, which is the ear sensitivity, then hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling, the ignition element takes place. So they all are elements which bear their own intrinsic nature. There is the hearing contact and hearing feeling. Hearing contact and hearing feeling are also ignition elements, and they also have their own nature. There is nothing else apart from these things, the striker element, receptor element, and the ignition element. By being mindful of the hearing, there will be sustained mindfulness. The mind will not run elsewhere. By being mindful of the hearing as a whole with sustained mindfulness, the defilements will not arise at the moment one is mindful of the hearing. That's why the yogis are advised to note the hearing when the hearing takes place, so that defilements will not arise connected with the hearing. The sparks arise when the matchstick is struck against the matchbox. But if they are kept apart, then the sparks will not arise. Only if one strikes the matchstick with the matchbox, the sparks arise. So if the question is asked, has the spark been already in the matchbox? It has not been. But at the tip of the matchstick also, the spark was not there at the first place. Only because the side of the matchbox and the tip of the matchstick come into contact, they produce the sparks. They alone, the matchbox alone or the matchstick alone, will not bring the sparks, but only because the side of the matchbox and the tip of the matchstick come into contact, that the sparks are produced. So here, the potassium nitrate from the matchbox and the tip of the matchstick come into contact to bring the spark. So this example is given to explain that when the sound waves come into contact, when the sound wave strikes the ear base, hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling takes place. So comparing with the example, the ear base is like the matchbox. The sound waves are like the matchsticks. The spark is compared to the hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling. So the matchbox is compared to the receptor element. The matchstick is compared to the striker element. And the sparks are compared to the ignition element, hearing consciousness, hearing contact, and hearing feeling. The example is given. Surya Kandamani is a kind of a stone, and when this kind of a stone come into contact with the sunlight, converging the sunlight and burns the fuel. An easier example is the magnifying glass. So Surya Kandamani is the stone that converges the sunlight to burn the fuel. If the sun rays are passing through a powerful magnifying glass onto a piece of paper, the magnifying glass converges the sunlight so that the heat builds up, burning the paper. The Surya Kanda Mani, the stone, or in other words, to make it easy, the magnifying glass is compared to the base element. And the sunlight is compared to the sound wave, the striker element. Burning of the paper, the ignition element, is compared to the sparks. So if the Surya Kandamani, if the stone is left alone, without passing the sunlight, it will not bring the spark, it will not burn the fuel. And if the sunlight alone will not give rise to sparks. If the stone and the sunlight do not come into contact, there will not be burning of the fuel. And also in the example of the magnifying glass, if the magnifying glass is left alone, it will not burn the paper. The sunlight alone will not burn the paper because the sunlight passes through the magnifying glass. As the sunlight converged through the magnifying glass onto the piece of paper, then the paper is burnt. So here there are relevant causes giving rise to relevant effect. As the sunlight passed through the magnifying glass onto the piece of paper, the paper is burnt. There are no other causes. So this example is explained to the striker element, receptor element, and the ignition element. At the moment of hearing, the nama rupa are arising as cause and effect. There is no creator that is creating. If all the circumstances are present, even though hundreds, thousands of creators are stopping the person to hear, but the person will hear because they are favorable circumstances. If there are no favorable circumstances, no favorable conditions, even though hundreds and thousands of creators are creating the person to hear, but the person will not hear. So, relevant cause give rise to relevant effect. The Creator cannot make a person to hear if there are no favorable circumstances to hear. The Creator cannot stop a person from hearing if all the conditions and causes are present in order to hear. So relevant cause give rise to relevant effect. There is no creator. And by understanding that relevant cause give rise to relevant effect, one removes the wrong view of Visamahetuka Ditti, fictitious cause view. And in order to discern through one's experience, one needs to be mindful at the moment of hearing. When the mind falls on the striker element, one discerns the striker element. When the noting mind falls on receptor element, one discerns the receptor element. And when the mind falls on the ignition element, one discerns the ignition element. But one does not discern all three at once, but one discerns one of the three elements by being mindful. When there is the receptor element and the striker element, then the ignition will take place. So these three elements are obvious in the hearing, and there are also other things that are not as obvious during the hearing. But when one is mindful, noting the object as hearing, one should not deliberately be analyzing, this is the striker, this is the receptor. So one should not deliberately be analyzing as the striker or the receptor or the ignition, but one should just note it as a whole, just as hearing. And Saraji gives the example, if a person wants to take a look at another person, the person has to take a look at the face. When one sees the forehead, when the eyes fall on the forehead, one sees the forehead. When the eyes fall on the cheeks, one sees the cheek. So one should just take a look at the face as a whole to see the person. In the same way, when noting the hearing, one should not be deliberately analyzing as the receptor, the striker, or the ignition, but one should just note it as a whole, just as hearing. When viriya, sati and samadhi, when effort, mindfulness and concentration become strengthened, one discerns one of the three elements at a time. So when the mind falls on the receptor element, then one will know that the ear is sensitive enough for the sound to come into one comes to know that the ear is sensitive enough for the sound to be struck. And also one comes to discern that the hearing consciousness and the sound wave come into contact on the ear. And because there are the ears, one hears. And it happens that the person discerns that the hearing is taking at this place, and the hearing consciousness and the sound waves are coming into contact at this certain place. In this way, one discerns the receptor element. And when the mind falls on the striker element, one comes to discern that it is striking, it is being heard, it is the feel of hearing. So in this way, one discerns the striker element. When one discerns the hearing consciousness, one comes to discern that hearing takes place dwelling in the ears, or just as one knows as mere hearing, or one discerns as the thing that takes the sound as the object. And discerning the contact, one discerns that the sound waves and the hearing consciousness are coming into contact. And there is also feeling that is connected with the hearing, such as pleasant, being the pleasantness or the unpleasantness in the hearing. In this way, one discerns the feeling. So these elements are arising at the moment of hearing. And when concentration becomes strong, one comes to discern one of these elements. So in order to discern, one should be noting the hearing with aim and effort, with sustained mindfulness. So this is the example of hearing. The same goes for seeing, smelling, tasting, and touching. And later on, Sayadaw will explain how one discerns the cause and effect. And this will be all for today. Sadhu.